even post Ethereum with Casper. And then I thought I would also then move on to, if that's all right with you, Norbert, I'll move on to token leasing and the Chintai token leasing project that we've also got on the go here. Just to give you probably some idea about the community activity that's going on worldwide. It's despite what John Oliver might have told you, it's definitely not a fraudulent project. You know, the code base is all there on GitHub to go and see, and we're running the active test nets at present, and I can definitely verify it's working. So with that said, let me just move on. If this actually will move on. Here we go. EOS itself is delegated proof of stake, which is a system invented by Dan Larimer, who is also the CTO of Block One, which is the company actually coding the EOS open source software. Delegated proof of stake has already been demonstrated to work in two quite notable blockchain projects, which most people will have heard of, namely BitShares, which is a decentralized exchange, and Steam, which is a social media platform for those unaware, and it works by upvoting, and that actually ends up paying a reward in Steam dollars to people based on the quality of their content. So it's again, between the two of them, they make up almost half of all of the actual blockchain activity on all of the open blockchains that you see right now, because delegated proof of stake, even in its more primitive forms like these, it has very high bandwidth and transaction per second capabilities. Now, it does that through a completely different system from the likes of proof of work. There are 21 block producers and 100 standbys, which instantly raises concerns about, isn't that a form of centralization? But of course, the countering back to that is, what about mining pools, and indeed the sort of centralization you see in proof of stake as well, whereby actually in practical terms, you might have as few as 4 or 5 actual controlling parties within that. So it's a very fine line between what is practical in an open blockchain and what necessarily is a purist, maybe academic perspective on some of these things. And that's probably where some of the, should we say, creative differences have come into play between the likes of Charles Hoskinson, who's the primary architect behind Cardano, and Daniel Larimer, who is EOS. But in terms of it, what that practically means is we get a block every half a second, and transactions become irreversible after 1 second, which makes it the fastest blockchain that's ever been created. That permanency is actually quite important from a processing capability. The longer that irreversibility figure, the lower the effective real-time performance of that. And consensus is then reached after you have 15 out of the 21 block producers. And one of the key design aspects of delegated proof of stake is the fact that transactions are feeless. Now, that actually is an important model, and that was something that when Norbert and I met in London, I was trying to sort of explain to him why I felt that gas was such a limitation for Ethereum, because even when they sort their scaling issues and go onto Casper, the full proof of stake version, they still are burdened with fees for transactions. And if we look at the most successful decentralized model that we have out there, the internet, you don't pay for using websites in the same way that you don't have to pay if you sign up and use Steam and start upvoting. And that's quite a limiter for anybody who is considering building distributed applications at present on some of the existing blockchains. They have to pass on, and there's a cost every single time you're interacting with a smart contract. So the way that these transactions are feeless, however, is inflation. And inflation is paid annually to the block producers, and we can come onto that in a separate discussion a little later on. On launch, we're looking at about 1,000 transactions per second on a single threaded blockchain with no optimization. And for those who are more technically minded, it's almost the EOS operating system itself is almost comparable to a thin Linux kernel in terms of what it actually is. Let's just move on beyond a couple of these. everything ultimately is a smart contract. So that's one fairly important detail that is quite different from the likes of Ethereum. But even the likes of delegated proof of stake voting and resource allocation will be via a smart contract as well. I'll very quickly move on and explain how some of the optimizations are going to be handled. They have something called context-free actions, which exists in another form in Ethereum as well, which are ultimately actions that can't be, they're read-only actions in effect. So that would be, an example would be looking up, for example, and confirming an address. What that they will do is take place in parallel with other execution, which in effect increases the computational speed and performance of EOS quite substantially. It means any kind of read-only actions can just take place in parallel, whereas distributed application processing will actually be the component that gets paid for. And perhaps I should take a step back and explain, if anybody's wondering what the EOS token itself is, every token has to have a purpose, right? It's either in the form of a currency, or it needs to be something else. And for EOS, it is a utility token. It buys you minimum guaranteed CPU or bandwidth usage on the operating system. So if you are a distributed application owner, you will need to hold a certain number of these tokens to actually ensure that you've got the required bandwidth to operate. And the alternative to that is leasing of tokens instead. So we can come on to that. That actually links into the Shintai platform that we're building to provide that leasing capability as well. But ultimately, block producers themselves have an incentive then to use these context-free actions too. So again, there's additional new functionality that's just been announced relating to security delayed transactions. And the reason that that's been done is that if you build out smart contracts, for example, on something like the DAO hack on Ethereum, most smart contracts can put in a delay before you could actually, for example, transfer funds directly out of the EOS system, which would enable you to then freeze the contract in this system, repair the code, and prevent that, so that you could actually prevent stealing tokens. There's obviously been, therefore, as you can see, some thought gone into previous issues that have occurred primarily on Ethereum, but also other smart contracts based platforms like this. This is quite a technical slide, so we'll move beyond that. In terms of scheduled transactions, that's another aspect that is also something that has just been rolled out. It gives a great deal of flexibility for anybody who's remotely technically minded here. You can have continually operating contracts that, in effect, to be fully Turing complete, you have to have that capability to continuously run. And that's something that Ethereum doesn't have, which is why it's not a Turing complete system. But in theory, therefore, it enables off-chain solutions to utilize functionality within EOS, and you could build, the example being given here is Netflix on a blockchain as such. You could carry out the storage off-chain, but all of the actual underlying functionality, therefore, would be located on them. And then the big thing that any audience has to get their head around is this concept of inter-blockchain communication. So although there will be a main chain, which is where all of your tokens will be linked, there will actually be the potential to spin out a potentially infinite number of additional EOS chains. Now, they won't actually dilute your tokens, because there won't be, the tokens will merely be moved across from the main chain onto these other ones and gradually become worth more and more with that. But the reason there is inter-blockchain communication is that actually enables, in theory, potentially limitless scaling. So never mind the mainnet having perhaps 7,000 transactions per second, you could start to get to hundreds of thousands of transactions per second, and certainly in theory even millions if you spin up sufficient numbers of chains. That's the solution for scaling that is being implemented within EOS, and that will be going live, I believe, by the end of December. So that's where I mentioned here, you've got 1 to 3,000 at launch, parallel processing pushes that to 6,000, into blockchain communication, potentially unlimited. And that's in itself one of the most exciting aspects of this. The third generation blockchains, all of them are promising to deliver the scalability that is required. But there will be this one EOS token on the main net that in effect is used as the bandwidth measurement for all of them. So that should, in theory, as the network gets bigger and bigger, drive demand for tokens up and up and up. And in theory, of course, supply and demand equals a valuation increase that goes with it. So you can see a clear use case for why there is that demand. Yeah, that was just the main thing. Now, otherwise, we can talk about Shintai next. I mean, did anybody have any questions about EOS first? I mean, it probably would be a good time to perhaps do a Q&A, Norbert, on any questions relating to what EOS is, how it differs from the likes of Cardano, or any of the other third-gen blockchains.
So if you have a question, you can either use the chat, there's a Q&A feature as well, or you should be able to kind of virtually raise your hand, and I should be able to switch you live if you actually want to talk. So David, one of the questions probably coming from the John Oliver kind of piece as well was this raising of $1.5 billion in cash and basically no software product yet available. And I think based on our conversation, there's lots of money that's available to build an ecosystem around it. So when we're talking about the June go live for EOS itself, it's not just kind of the pure blank blockchain. There's lots of functionality that people are already building and will release in short order.
That's totally right. I mean, where most of the suspicion around EOS has come about is the fact that in their disclaimers, their legal disclaimers, Block One describe themselves purely as a software company, and they're doing that for tax reasons. Ultimately, they are therefore not technically a crypto company at all, and they're not even launching the main chain. They're not launching a blockchain. They're leaving that to the community to do, which is exactly the same model that took place with BitShares and with Steam. So it therefore unnerves investors naturally that whole idea that is this another fraudulent ICO when you look at that concept. However, when you actually start to look under the surface at the underlying nature of this, that there is very clear that there's companies all around the world now, block producers, that are setting up to actually launch the chain. You know, of which we can come on to EOS 42, which is the London-based block producer, which I've co-founded. We are already a team of 5 globally, probably likely to be about 8 by launch, could be as high as 15 by next summer, depending on the scaling requirements. So, you know, the community is highly active. You just have to take a look in the Telegram channels. Most people who actually take a look at EOS quickly realize it has one of the most vibrant, active communities that it actually exists. And you're absolutely right. I mean, Norbert, the other thing that was always an open question is, well, if it's being fully funded privately, this software, and then open source, what do you need all of this money for? Because everyone talks about X, Y, and Z being the biggest ICO in history. Actually, the biggest ICO in history is still ongoing, and that is EOS. It has quietly been sitting there. I think at the last count, it was on 1.5 billion. I think you maybe could argue that the Telegram ICO is even bigger, although there's some open questions about quite what they're going to do with their money. But what is happening with the money raised for the ICOs for EOS is that they have committed to forming a VC fund exclusively to fund distributed app companies to release on EOS itself. And the model that they are following is that if they fund you the money, you token airdrop to all of the existing EOS token holders as your sort of give back. So in effect, they bypass the ICO process and they give out their tokens to EOS holders. So we've already got airdrops coming from about 4 different companies that are launching apps on there. The notable one is Everpedia, which is it's kind of like a monetized version of Wikipedia that is being founded actually by the co-founder of Wikipedia. And the entire model of that is similar to Steam, which is that people will receive IQ tokens based on the quality of their inputs into Everpedia and the timeliness of it. And that will be voted by the community, upvoted. And that gives a real incentive, therefore, to keep it accurate. It also, by being decentralized, prevents any kind of censorship, which is a criticism that's being increasingly leveled at Wikipedia, for example. But the whole model, therefore, is with that, and Mike Novogratz, who is ex-Goldman Sachs, ex-Galaxy, and in fact has formed Galaxy Digital, he's put another $350 million in as an EOS exclusive fund as well. They are looking to just, again, fund VC projects on this. So if you think about that, $1.3 billion worth of projects will be launching on EOS gradually, with a model whereby the majority of those will be airdropping tokens to EOS holders. So by holding, not only can you expect in theory to lease your tokens out and get a rental income from them, you can expect your wallet to gradually just fill up with other airdrop tokens as well. It's quite a compelling model, and I think, you know, Norbert, you and I discussed the underlying reasons for that, and my own view is quite simply that they realise that community momentum and investment is the only way that they will actually gain enough traction with EOS for it to eventually become dominant. So right now, of course, Ethereum rightly has first mover advantage in the space. It's got a huge amount of developer support. It's also got a lot of problems that it needs to overcome from its inherent design, but it is undeniably and rightly the number 2 valued token on the market, the number 1 in terms of being a smart platform. So the response effectively for EOS, therefore, is huge inward investment to incentivize people not just to look at it and say this is a superior platform for rolling out much more scalable, high volume required applications, but as well, it's a means of incentivizing them to just actually be able to bypass the expensive ICO process too.
Yeah, thank you. And so going back to kind of the evolution and kind of what Dan has done throughout his career with Steam first and then BitShares. I mean, always trust somebody who does something for the third time, because it's surely as smart as they are, they're not making the same mistakes again. So that's a good thing, actually, right? As young as the industry is, to have somebody who's actually made mistakes.
Yeah, I agree with you. He's probably the most experienced blockchain developer in the world, actually, in terms of his background and experience. I mean, there's a lot of interactions between himself and Satoshi back in the very earliest days in 2010, discussing scaling issues with Bitcoin, and him disagreeing with Satoshi on the block size limit, which actually had been put in for security reasons rather than scaling being the concern back then. It was a proof of concept, so that's a bit of an irrelevance. But you're right, and with BitShares, what actually happened is that Daniel Larimer rolled it out without inflation at all, and then had to come to the community and say, well, we now need more money to continue developing and enhancing the platform. And the community said, no, we don't want to vote for inflation. This sounds bad. So he had to leave the project, and eventually they turned around and realized that they had no choice but to add inflation in, because it's the lifeblood of investment into the platform. You know, we traditionally view fiat inflation as a bad thing, and rightly so. It's governments producing additional money and at source, and a very limited way that it's shared. You could argue it's being invested. It depends whether you consider government spending to be efficient or not. With delegated proof of stake inflation, however, it is used for a combination of things, and this comes onto the role of a block producer within EOS. And there is some debate about exactly what a block producer could be. They could be effectively not that different from an Ethereum miner, which would be they simply provide the network support and nothing else, or it could be a much more advanced role where they additionally provide a community role, where they use additional block rewards to fund projects, to carry out education, to maybe fund some charitable donations, and so on and so forth. You could expand out what the value add could be to a whole range of things. And the interesting part about that is that they always are answerable back to the token holders. There is an ongoing election that never ends. So on the 2nd of June, when we launch the main chain, we launch it and we don't get paid at that point. So we have until we hold an election. And the moment we hold an election, the real top 21 will emerge, regardless of who were the launch 21. And at that point, they are going to be continually watching the performance of both the technical performance and the community level performance of these BPs. And it will be a consensus by the community as to whether or not they feel that the inflation rate being proposed by us is greedy or indeed too low to be credible. They're going to be looking at the individuals within each of the teams. They're going to be looking at what potential value add you are bringing back to the ecosystem. And if you're not deemed good enough, in theory, you drop out of the top 21. So there's that continual, there's almost a continual competitive nature. You have to look around at all the other BPs in theory and think to yourself, we need to try and be better than them. That's certainly the theory behind it. The only thing that would really undo that is if the token base became so centralized that somebody ended up with 51% control. And in that scenario, I suppose what would almost certainly happen is you would spin off another EOS chain, honor the original distribution, and cut out the individual who had the over-centralized control, which wouldn't be difficult to do, but obviously not an ideal. However, the beauty of the this 1 year ICO for EOS is that it's been allocating 2 million tokens a day for almost a year, and that is enabled a very, very decentralized token holding across hundreds of countries as a result. So we're in pretty good shape for launch, I think.
Great. Let's go back once to the third generation blockchains. I think the first order question is, whom would you count among kind of the third generation, and where do you see the relative strengths and weaknesses kind of among those?
Yeah, I mean, the big criticism that's been leveled at EOS is that DPoS has got a centralized nature by virtue of the 21 block producers, although actually it's 121 at any one time. And just 21 being elected. Therefore, the likes of Cardano have a slightly different system whereby they have a higher number of block producers. I think they have a slightly different terminology for it. And then obviously you get into more ambitious and theoretical projects like IOTA, which actually, Norbert, I think you know a lot more about it than I do. But again, it's a completely different network there, but it's at the moment unproven in terms of its scalability. And if you look at Cardano, for example, they've rolled out a simple mainnet with no smart contract support at present. They're quite some ways off that. So it's quite complex to actually, at the moment, look at the underlying comparatives between them. I've seen some very vigorous debate between the founders of both EOS and Cardano back and forth with one another. For example, Dan Larimer's view is that a lot of the changes, and his view is that Cardano is actually delegated proof of stake as well in everything but name, and that they've made some various changes on the views to try and make it more decentralized that have a huge long-term impact on its irreversibility, so that its irreversibility could be as much as 20 seconds instead of 1, which actually has a dramatic impact on its performance if he's right on that. Now, you would hear a very different view back on that from Charles Hoskinson. It will be interesting seeing. I think the only way you can look at all of these third-gen blockchains, and indeed the upgraded Ethereum when it eventually happens, although my view is there'll probably be a hard fork there'll be a proof of work version and then a full pure proof of stake version that will eventually hard fork later in the year when that goes through. I don't see the miners giving those lucrative token mining up personally, but what we will see is an ongoing experiment where we all get to see a number of different approaches, and we'll see which one becomes the most successful. That's kind of the exciting thing about this whole space, and I think why people need to not get too tribal about any one blockchain. Actually, it's we're all experimenting, we're all continually learning with this, and this is an opportunity to see which is the most effective end solution. Where EOS is perhaps different from some of the others is that it's actually putting in a full governance mechanism too. So it will include arbitration as well. So that in theory, you would have the ability to, certainly in theory, whether or not this absolutely gets confirmed, even be able to report fraudulent funds, freeze a contract and the funds. It would go through an arbitration process with an independent arbitrator at the human level. And then based on the decision that was agreed and published out, after 30 days, the block producers would undo a transaction. So, that's quite a dramatic difference from the likes of the purists within, say, the Ethereum community saying, once it's on a blockchain and something goes through, that's it forever. You know, that has, it's more of a recognition that when there's human beings involved in a system, mistakes happen, you know, bad actors do come up, and hacks can occur. And we need to try and provide some sort of security or should we say reassurance for people in a blockchain, open blockchain like this, whereby they are not terrified, for example, of rolling out a smart contract because they can't change the code. So it's going to be interesting, I think, seeing where all of this evolves. It's fast evolving, but there are a lot of projects all under the surface right now that will be launching on EOS. I mean, EOS FinX is the big one, which is effectively probably going to replace the FinX idea. Bitfinex are going for a decentralized exchange on EOS. Tesloop have just announced they're going to put their Tesla car sharing platform, a component of that on EOS. There's a decentralized bank that I'm actually advising, which will be rolling out on EOS later in the year, and that's US-based primarily initially, and they're working very closely with the regulators to enable people to hold their crypto assets and their fiat money all in a combined account with complete banks level security. So there's some, you know, fascinating, quite large projects that are actually all under the surface right now that I think most people on the open market have no clue about. So I think we're going to see quite a radical shift in awareness of EOS. It's quietly gone from when I first started following it, about number 40 on the coin market cap list, up to now I think it's number 6 on the list in terms of its position. And that's just really reflected, despite other market conditions, a gradual awareness that a lot of smart money is gradually moving across and into it. You know, when Mike Novogratz decided to get rid of the distributed banking fund idea and simply put it all into EOS, I think that was a pretty big vote of confidence, you know, from somebody who knows a lot. And yeah, I've done the same, right? So I wouldn't say I'm as smart as these guys, but I mean, ultimately, I looked at all the different systems, and the more I found out about EOS, the more compelling it seemed to be as for me, the most likely third generation blockchain that would be able to realize the potential for enabling decentralization.
Yeah, and I think that, thank you, Dave. I mean, that's the interesting part of this conversation, right? We all have an opinion, and we can talk about this a long time, but unless people actually have the tokens and have money on the line, you're basically putting your money and your career or your time on the line, and you have a choice to take other tokens or other blockchain technologies and kind of focus on these, but you've chosen EOS, and so clearly the conviction comes through, and we should let you get back to like Chintai and explain this as well, because that's super interesting as an application on top.
So Shinty is actually a good example of what a block producer could do. And by that, I mean in terms of producing value-adding projects back for the community. So we started looking at EOS 42 as a block producer, and any good strategy is, at the heart of strategy is uniqueness. So understanding what our unique selling proposition was going to be to the community was something we started to consider. In parallel with that, my background in banking and trading systems meant that I was naturally interested in the whole concept of a leasing market and had a fairly clear idea of how order management and execution probably ought to work based on my background there. But it became quite apparent that there was not going to be a leasing market on launch. In fact, there isn't even a leasing contract. There's staking and unstaking, which probably comes down to pressures from, I'm speculating, but it could well be down to pressures from Block One in terms of getting the overriding project, you know, ready at the base level for launch. But on that basis, we proposed, and I co-authored a white paper out to the community for a feeless token leasing platform, which means that if you're a distributed app holder or you're a token holder, both sides will be able to lease tokens completely for free. And you have to ask your question, well, how's that possible? And that comes back to the block rewards for the block producers. So EOS 42 and another 6 to date token holders, block producers rather, are all going to be backing this platform. They will not only back the ongoing running costs of it, they will back the post-launch development costs of that. And in the meantime, because it's going to be a community-owned platform too, that's meant I've been able to get out to the wider EOS community and pull in a core team of about 7 or 8 people so far, with varying skill sets. Some super technical, some are user interface and front end focused, and they're all putting in their time right now for the initial build, so that we can have a pretty basic launch platform. It will be manual matching. You'd put your tokens up for whatever you think the given rate should be, and over a given term period. There's an equivalent on Steam called Minnow Booster, and it will have a very similar level of functionality to that. The difference is that we already envisage algorithmic execution and matching, and a whole range of an internal token that will be used for a valuation mechanism. So we've got some quite ambitious plans. They're all outlined in the white paper if anybody's interested in seeing that. It's Chintai-EOS.io, the website address for the project. But again, it's an interesting example of what is possible, I think, in a decentralized community like this, whereby actually, and for me, it's a sort of showing how block producers can add value beyond perhaps what is maybe envisaged from traditional miners. They've got their interest completely aligned with the community. They propose a project, and actually they can fund the whole thing as well. And I'm talking about community projects rather than commercial ones, because if they're commercial, people are going to do it anyway. But for anything that feels like a community project, there's a big incentive for block producers to get out and actually start doing something like that, because it will say to the voters, we're not just here just to support the block production. We're actually going to really add a huge value add beyond that. So yeah, I mean, ultimately for EOS 42, that was our opportunity to show, even at the earliest stage, this is where we can add some value here. And by carrying the project forwards in parallel now with the community, hopefully that's demonstrating to the community we're sincere about doing this, right? I mean, actions speak louder than words with these things. But it's going very well so far. It's been interesting. I think it'll be exciting seeing the launch platform getting released onto the main net on sometime in early June, and seeing that actually out there. I suspect though, when we do, you'll find token leasing will be super low, and probably early activity on the main net will be low, as you would expect with the launch of any chain. So do we have any questions about Shintai? It's difficult for me to, I could go into the quite advanced functionality levels on it, but it's probably more, maybe I should talk at a higher level about why you would want to lease tokens, so people get that, because as I mentioned, it buys you bandwidth. And you might be asking to yourself, well, if I'm setting up an application on EOS, why would I bother leasing when I can just own the tokens? And right now at these levels, I would probably agree with that. Where they're only about $6 a token, it's cheap. And I would look ahead and think, well, there's quite a lot of appreciation potential here, with all this potential good news finally hitting the market, and then becoming aware of all these other projects, the mainnet going live, the potential risk of no chain launching being removed when people get issued their actual EOS tokens, not the ERC20s. I would probably, as a distributed app holder, be holding a load myself, but fairly rapidly, you imagine the token price goes to 20, 30, 40. If you're achieving parity with Ethereum, it might be hitting, $60, $70 a token. That starts to get very, very expensive indeed, guaranteeing bandwidth for you as a distributed app holder. Or you might look at this and say, look, hang on a minute, we're holding millions and millions of dollars of tokens here. This isn't our business model. Our business model is to do this. It would be like all the shops on the high street owning the actual the actual shops themselves rather than renting. Their business is maybe selling things, and they're not interested in tying up huge amounts of capital in the real estate. And really, that's probably the best parallel with EOS tokens, because they're buying you that access to the underlying system. That's likely what we'll find will happen, that more and more people will take the much, much cheaper option of leasing out instead. And as well, they can lock in for a guaranteed rate for perhaps a year or even more, exactly what their cost base is going to be with that as well. So I think it's all going to be fascinating. No one's really 100% sure yet how the leasing market will evolve, and that's one of the reasons we are going to launch and have a very flexible distributed governance mechanism, whereby community work proposals will actually be submitted. And it will be then for the community to actually decide what they think is should be the future direction of the platform. You got any questions on EOS or Shintai that you wanted to?
No question coming through here just yet. So
no.
For those people who are more interested in the speculation aspect and the technology, you kind of gave a hint as to what you might see as a future. And so like parity to Ethereum in terms of total market cap is something that you think is within reach?
I mean, if my estimate has always been by about the year end, it ought to have approximately half Ethereum's value. So I actually don't know what Ethereum's currently at. It's probably at about $300 right now, something like that. It's dropped a lot, I know. But that ought to be therefore around about $150 a token, right? So whether it really, got to those sorts of levels, I don't think so. I think realistically, I can see this being an exponential increase, and it will, just based on the fact that this is going to be a highly usable system, and virtually every single commercial project and business I'm bumping into, the moment they find out about it, they are moving off Ethereum and starting to rebase their code. And just to make matters probably more challenging for Ethereum, they're even talking about making it as easy as possible to port directly across, and indeed to be able to have a sandbox contract that actually emulates all of Ethereum off a single smart contract inside EOS. So, there's a lot of potential to very quickly port some projects off. Now, it works very well for low volume and high value transactions, Ethereum, because of its design. What it doesn't work for is low value, high volume, and that is unfortunately a huge portion of the business models that we have online. So that is where you're going to see, I think, people really starting to pick up. And as soon as the first big social media platform launches on EOS, which is already in development, that will be a great illustration, I think, of what the platform can do. As when you get a decentralized bank and EOS FinTech also launching as a decentralized exchange, it's going to start giving real credibility to the platform, I think, because people are then going to realize what it's capable of doing, and its sheer speed. So it will be very interesting to see that from a speculative point of view. Therefore, well, look, I mean, I would say that there's a reason it's now broken its way up into the top 10 and is now overtaking all of the other Gen 3 blockchains in terms of market cap. I think Cardano, you went back to the beginning of the year, was 3 times its current valuation, and it's now exceeded it. And the reason for that is being that growing awareness of exactly what the product is going to be. It's, people can review the GitHub activity. I think it's the highest GitHub activity in the crypto space, apart from, I think it was Bitcoin actually is still top, which was surprising, but it's the second highest, and over the last 3 months, which really should tell everybody just how much activity is going on right now, and that's aside from all the side distributed app projects that are in development.
Mm-hmm. We had one question coming through here. I thought maybe we can get over without a regulatory question, but it's obviously very front and center. So if you do the token leasing on Chintai, right, what does it mean from a regulatory environment in different countries? What would need to happen?
Well, if you think about what leasing is, because this is a utility token, it should not be governed anywhere as a security. Now, the reality, on the other hand, is that certain governments have very confused views on this, and the most obvious one is the US, where different agencies within the US view it as different things. So, one agency in the US would view all tokens as securities. Another would view this one as something equivalent to real estate intent. So I think it's the IRS that views all token sales as equivalent to real estate right now. they've got a confused view that's not mature. As such, both China and the US have been exempt from the token sales. Now, they are also, just from what we can see from the token distribution, seem to also be the two biggest holders of EOS tokens, which is interesting, isn't it? It shows you what that kind of thing does. I guess once it goes on the open market, nobody stops people making their own decisions on these things. It's a great question, though, in terms of regulation about the general buying and selling of the tokens. What happens with leasing is that you would therefore have to look at this as income. And when you look at the income, then there is an open question regarding when is the income actually realized, which is logically the moment that the token, at the end of each cycle, Chintai will pay people in EOS so you'll get additional EOS gradually for leasing out. Obviously, it'll be a low rate, but you will get more EOS. So it represents income, but of course, it's income that fluctuates versus your default domestic fiat currency. So it's very difficult for any government to sit there and say you've made this much when, for example, in January, the EOS token price was at $16 at a peak roughly, and it's now at $6. So actually, where until that's locked and converted back to fiat, it's very difficult for any government to claim that that's been a point of that. So it probably really for me reflects that governments are playing catch up on this stuff. There's a dynamic decentralized economy evolving, and they really don't know how to handle it in terms of from a regulatory and tax perspective. There is no regulation relating to token leasing at all. I mean, on a decentralized platform like this, it goes beyond governments. They can't regulate it, right? But on the other hand, it's self-regulating anyway, in that you have to hold EOS tokens to lease, and there has to be someone on the other side of the trade to actually lease them out at an agreed rate. So there's nothing too dramatic about that. There's no change of ownership. There's just merely staking and the tokens locking for that period of time. But the tax implications relating to regulation are a very interesting one indeed, and not something I can give tax advice on, I'm afraid, but it is an interesting one for sure.
Cool, thank you. We got more questions coming, great. It's a great presentation. Tezos also promoted as a highly advanced third generation DPoS token, which EOS will be superior to Tezos now that they come back together, actually.
Yeah. I mean, at the time, actually, everybody was pretty much putting Tezos and EOS head to head, and I was similarly watching Tezos with real interest. And what has really put it so far on the back foot regarding anything else? And it probably ought to tell people that delegated proof of stake is a strong system by virtue of the fact that Tezos is also using the same Daniel Larimer's own invention, but they had these problems just after the ICO launch, which I think at the time it was the biggest ICO of all time, I believe, when it first launched and kicked off. And they had some sort of falling out with the development team, I believe, and basically while that falling out happened, development on the Tezos system had frozen for about 6 months or so. So that's the sign there. It undermines confidence in a system for sure, that kind of thing. I'm not that familiar, therefore, I know that Tezos is gaining a lot of momentum again, and I think it'll be good to see it launch because I consider it one of the contenders when it does. Its main challenge will be making up for the lost time, because I think it would have originally launched ahead of EOS, and it's not going to now. So, they're going to be therefore on the back foot behind EOS in the same way that Cardano in effect is.
Oops. Well, that might have been David's connection now. Let's see if he notices that for a moment. Well, we're at the 50-minute mark, so I think we've got